everyone. I'm Rachel Kaur Khan, founder and CEO of Productable. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to take a minute to talk about this webinar series, The Invisible Enemies of Innovation. So, these enemies are some of the most common roadblocks to innovation success. And Productable, in work with the Air Force and large corporations, has come up with a solution against every single one of these. So you can see we have a few different ones that we've thought about. Dan, if you can pop to the next slide for a sec. And but we're so confident that we can help you tackle all of these invisible enemies head on. And so that's what this series is all about, giving innovators and innovation leaders tactical ways to accelerate change. So today we're talking about enemy number 9, fear of failure. This is honestly my favorite one. And I really can't think of a better person to share his perspective on this. He's such a proponent of learning to fail gracefully and making it acceptable and even a cherished part of the innovation journey. So with that, I'd love to introduce Dan Ward. Dan is a retired lieutenant colonel of the Air Force. He's an innovation catalyst for the MITRE Corporation, and he's the author of 3 amazing books on innovation, Fire, Lift, and The Simplicity Cycle. Dan's also one of the country's leading experts on portfolio approach of innovation for the government, which is one of the reasons of many that he's one of our trusted advisors here at Productable. So with all of that, I couldn't be more excited to hand this to Dan and have him tell you more about invisible enemy number 9, fear of failure, and tell us how we overcome it. Thanks so much, Dan.
Hey, thank you so much, Rachel. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to be here and really looking forward to this chat. So we're here to talk about failure for a little bit. And I can't say I want to, but we should start with an uncomfortable truth that, frankly, I would love to deny, but I can't deny it. And that is that failure is inevitable. Okay, no matter how smart or strong or rich or lucky or tall or good looking we are, sometimes things just don't work out the way we'd like. I think that's an important place to start because, the sooner we acknowledge this uncomfortable truth, the sooner we can do something about it. And that is the good news. So yes, failure is inevitable. We can't avoid it entirely. But here comes the good news, we can influence the direction in which we fail. Okay, we can often choose what type of potential failures we will even be exposed to. So at the risk of oversimplifying things, I do like to think of 2 types of failure. All right, I'm sure there's more than 2, but I find it helpful to distinguish between what I call epic failures and optimal failures. So an optimal failure costs a little and teaches us a lot. And in contrast, an epic fail is the opposite. It costs a lot and it teaches us a little. So you can kind of see the difference here on this graph, on this little grid. Now, when we launch some huge mega project where we assemble a cast of thousands and we spend decades and billions, those types of projects only fail one way. They only fail epic. When we've made a huge investment of time and people, the cost of failure is high. And then because the time between the start and the fail is so long, we make decisions early in the project, but we don't see the full consequences of those decisions until later. And so the more time there is between cause and effect, the harder it is to learn. Connections get obscured, things get forgotten. And honestly, even if we have perfect recall, it still just takes a long time to see the outcome. It takes a long time to know what the lesson even is. And similarly, complexity obscures. So on a big, complicated project with complicated technologies and big, complicated organizational structures and complex processes, it is just harder to learn the right lessons in a timely way. Okay, so the alternative to this epic fail is to deconstruct these big projects into a series, a portfolio, one might say, of short, fast projects. When these types of projects fail, they only fail one way, they fail optimally. Okay, our costs and our losses are contained, so it costs less, and we have an easier time learning because there's less time between cause and effect. So the person who makes a decision early on gets a front row seat to the implications of that decision. They get to see how things turned out. Of course, simplicity also makes learning easier too, because cause and effect is easier to trace when our processes, our technologies, our system architectures, and our organizations are all simple. So again, complexity obscures. All right, so if we're talking about fear of failure here, optimal failures are just less scary. Okay, they don't hurt as much and they teach us more. I'm not saying we should never expose ourselves to any epic fails. Look, some of those projects that have the potential of failing epic, sometimes those are worth the risk. I am saying that we often have an alternative in the types of failures we might expose ourselves to, and those alternatives are worth exploring. And one of the ways we do that is to reduce our costs and increase our opportunities to learn. We break that big project into an incremental series of smaller projects. So in a defense acquisition context, which is definitely my background, that might mean using modular contracting, which FAR Part 39.103 actually says we should use as much as practicable or as much as possible anyway. It might mean portfolio management. DoD Directive 7045.20. Yes, I memorized that number. That says we should be doing capability portfolio management as much as possible. All right, so we've talked about epic fails and optimal fails. We talked about how we can position our programs in such a way that when they fail, they're more likely to fail optimal. And I want to now shift away from types of failures and talk more about what do we do when we fail? Okay, so whether it's an epic fail or an optimal fail, kind of doesn't matter. The thing we should do is eat cake. And I literally mean cake. So my team has this terrific practice that we call failure cake. So here's a picture of one of the cakes that my team has eaten. I took that picture, I ate that cake, it was delicious. A failure cake is what it sounds like. When something goes wrong, we like to order up a cake, and then we sit around and we eat it together. And as we eat that cake, we talk about our failure. All right, this has several benefits. First, cake is delicious, and it's celebratory. So it shifts the mood, it boosts morale. These are important things. It changes the atmosphere, and it's communal. And because it's communal, that helps take the sting out, because we're all in this together. We're all supporting each other. So a failure cake helps to destigmatize failure, which is super important. It's hard to cast blame when you're all eating cake together. And it positions us to learn, because as we're eating the cake, we're talking about the experience. What did we learn? What did we experience? What did we accomplish? What did we attempt? What might we do different next time? On top of all of that, and this is one of my favorite things about failure cake. Actually, the fact that cake is delicious is my top favorite thing, but one of my other favorite things is that failure cake makes us bold and resilient. Okay, failure cake makes us more likely to try again or to try something new, because when we have a culture of failure cake, when we have a culture that says, this is how we deal with failure, it creates an environment where we say, the worst case scenario is we might get some cake. And that's a pretty good worst case scenario. And so when that's your worst case scenario, again, you're more likely to be bold and resilient and to try stuff. Now, we actually do two types of failure cake. The first version is what I just described. That's the picture you see here. This is the small team specific failure kind, where we made an attempt, we tried something, it didn't work out. All right, we're going to get the team together, we're going to have some cake, we're going to talk about it. The other variety is something we've only done 2 or 3 times, but it's pretty cool. And this is sort of a general invitation to a large group instead. So here's what that looks like. A few times now, we've bought a huge sheet cake, and we write something like congratulations on failing or something like that. And we set up a table in a public space, like a cafeteria. And then we offer free cake to everybody who's walking past. And the only catch is we also have that whiteboard and a bunch of yellow stickies. And in order to get the cake, you have to write down a brief failure story on one of these yellow stickies and put it up on our whiteboard. And when you do that, bam, free cake for you. You don't have to sign it, nothing, you don't have to put your name on or anything. You can just kind of tell your story to whatever degree of detail or make it as personal as you'd like. So some of these stories end up being pretty funny, some of them are poignant, some are pretty general, some are specific. But as the whiteboard fills up, that sends a pretty important signal to everybody. And the message is everyone has a failure story. So again, this is a communal experience. It helps destigmatize failure. It creates space for learning because as people are putting their failure stories on the board, they're reading everybody else's. And one more time, it bears repeating, cake is delicious. Okay, now there's a little bit of nuance that I want to explain here. Despite the title of this webinar, we're not actually technically celebrating failure. Okay, failure sucks. We don't want to fail. We would rather not fail. And oftentimes the failures themselves aren't really what's worth celebrating. What we're really doing is celebrating the attempt. We're celebrating the boldness. We're celebrating the creativity. We're celebrating the courage that it took for somebody to try something new. That is always worth celebrating. Okay, so this brings us to the third and final point that I wanted to make in my 10 minutes here. I think the best thing to do with our failures, which again are inevitable and come in a variety of different types, but the best thing to do with our failures is to study them. So I do like to use the F word. I call them what they are. This is a failure. I like to make a list of them and study that list for patterns, for insights, for repeated structures and repeated outcomes. Analyze our failures to distinguish between promising paths and dead-end paths. Hey, we tried something that didn't work out, but it got close, as opposed to we tried something and that didn't work out and it was never going to work out. So the former we should do more of, the latter we should do less of. So we want to make a note of the progress and the partial successes in each failure story. So making that list is simultaneously the easiest and the hardest part of this whole thing. Okay, it's easy in the sense that it's just a list. Like there's nothing hard mechanically about doing that. But it can be difficult psychologically because we have to face our failures. We have to be honest about our failures. And although that can be difficult, I would suggest that not doing that actually makes your life even harder than doing it. But it can also be difficult for a whole other reason. One more little twist at the end here, and that's because we oftentimes don't actually have any failures to put on the list. When we sit down to try and make a list of our failures, we might discover, hey, I've sat in a lot of meetings, I've sent a lot of emails, I listened to a lot of briefings, but I haven't actually done anything that constitutes a failure or a success. If you find yourself in that situation, you sit down to make your list of failures and you can't think of any, don't worry, we have a solution for that too. Write down, I failed to fail at the top of that list. And then go try something, go do something that will produce an actual outcome, which you can then put on your list. Okay, so I'll wrap up with this final observation. We started with the uncomfortable truth that failure is inevitable. So I want to finish with a comforting truth, something that I've discovered as I've studied failure, my own and others. And I think you will find this to be true when you study failure, because it is such a consistent pattern. And the comforting truth that I want to leave you with is this, that failure is never the whole story. Failure is never the end of the story. Failure is only part of the story. And what comes next, what you choose to do next, that's what really matters. So I hope you have some delicious cake. I hope you have some beautiful communal experiences around acknowledging failures, studying failures, talking about them, and then using that as a stepping stone for whatever you do next. So with that, let's open it up to some questions.
That was so awesome, Dan. I love this concept, and I think it was just amazing also to watch in the chat how I feel like food groups for innovation have kind of formed. It's like your pizza failures, your cupcake pivots, like I could really see a new startup here that's all about which food for failure. So thanks for starting a new category of thoughts there. To take
I'm
one,
totally in favor of pizza, cupcakes, pasta. Hey, whatever works for you, for
it
sure.
sounds it sounds like carbs are a critical element.
Whatever you find delicious. Yep.
Well, we got a great question from Bill here. How do you know when it's a failure and when you should stop trying to make something a thing?
Oh, that is a terrific question. From an entrepreneur's perspective, and Rachel, you know this better than I do, the perpetual question that is always on the table is, do we persist, pivot, or perish? Like, that's got to be constantly on your mind. Do I keep doing this? Is it working out or not? Should I be doing something different, or should we stop? Um, there's no easy button for answering that question. I found the most effective way to answer it well and to know you've answered it well is to do it collaboratively, to get the insight of others, to pose the question in the first place, which I think just asking that question is half the battle. Because so oftentimes we don't even remember to ask it. We just sort of keep doing what we're doing, or we quit prematurely. But putting the question on the table and talking with your trusted advisors, talking with your customers, hey, are we getting close? And the other shorter answer to that is, the more we study failure, the more we'll be able to sort of hone that instinct and hone that awareness of, like, yeah, this hasn't worked out yet, but I think we can keep going, or no, I think we need to stop on this one. So the more we get that, build up that muscle memory, or that practice of studying failure, the more likely we'll be able to answer that question accurately.
I love that answer, Dan. And something that I thought was really cool when you taught me about this failure cake concept, I'm going to steal a question here. Um, we're both trained engineers, and when you go into engineering school, you're basically taught that you can't fail. People die when you fail, and that you can't mess up. And it's like a completely different mentality. So personally, when early in my career, it was always just this like, can't mess up, and just holding on to everything. And I love that failure is an option. And so, can you help? Because I don't know how I made the shift, and maybe you're better at articulating it. But there was a point in my career where I was like, I don't think I really fail. I'm doing pretty good. And I didn't really know how to break things up into failure points, if that makes sense. How
Yeah,
do
yeah. I think it's a topic that we often avoid. Henry Petrosky is sort of the poet laureate of engineering. He wrote a great book titled "To Engineer is Human," and his book is all about studying failure. That's where I learned so much from him. So, I'd recommend, like, there's a fair amount of material out there in the world to read about this stuff. Henry Petrosky's books are a great place to start. But I think we start by posing the questions. I'm at the point in my life and career where I have more questions than answers, and I find them just more interesting. So asking the question, is this a failure? How do we deal with failure? I see David's comment about being in the military and DoD doesn't accept failure. In large part, when we find an environment where we don't accept failure, it's probably because they are more familiar with the optimal failure, with the epic failures, and less familiar with optimal failures. So when we introduce the concept of an optimal failure, when we introduce the reality that failure is inevitable, now we can see failure as something that doesn't cost as much, but it does teach us a lot. That makes them more tolerable, and again helps to increase the boldness and the willingness to try stuff. The other thing that senior leaders can do is to host the failure cake party themselves, and be the first to put your yellow sticky up on the board, right?
I love that. I feel like you partially answered David Brewer's question, but just to see if you have anything else to add on it, he said, I'm in the military, but DoD leadership does not accept failure. In fact, failure is not an option. Have you discovered a method to impact the culture to allow our junior force to take the necessary risks to both succeed and fail?
Yeah, so let me offer my quick definition of culture. Culture is one of those words where there's a lot of jazz hands and vagueness and ambiguity about what that word even means. So I define culture as shared beliefs and behaviors. So if we want to have a culture that has a healthy perspective on failure, one of those beliefs might be failure is inevitable. One of the behaviors might be we do failure cakes on a regular basis. So we can be clear about what our beliefs are about failure, and we can express those beliefs in particular concrete behaviors. And that's how we build a culture. Culture doesn't change overnight. Culture is not monolithic. Culture is not static. So it's an ongoing effort to build a healthy, effective culture that knows how to deal with failure. And maybe we should all be wearing hats like mine that says, failure is an option. Should sell these on my website or something, right?
We'll buy 700,000 hats. Awesome. I love that so much, Dan. I think there was one last question from Bill. This one's a tough one. How do you help someone not be so emotional about their favorite toy and admit that it's time to move on? Oof.
Boy, that is a challenging one. I think when we take a portfolio-based approach, when we have a lot of options on the table and a lot of things we're playing with, we get less attached to the one and we get more attached to the overall outcome. So we're less invested, we're less committed to the one way of doing things, and more open to the idea that, hey, there is more than one way to do almost everything. And again, that doesn't happen overnight, doesn't happen universally, it won't happen with everybody, but putting more options on the table, I think is one way to do that.
I love that. And I think also when you force portfolio decisions and more stages of decisions, people can only get so emotionally attached if you only let them have a toy for so long. So if we have really big, I almost want to go to your first chart and say when you have really big projects, those become really, really big toys. And yeah, the high cost, that's the big expensive slow, those are big toys.
Right. If we spend 20 years on developing some new system or some new thing, like we really get invested and connected. If we spend 6 months developing something and we know we're going to spend the next 6 months doing something else, again, the failure stings less.
Yeah, man, I love that. We're actually drinking our own champagne and trying some of that here at Productable. So Dan, is there anything else that you want to share with us? Any last thoughts?
Yeah, just thanks again to everybody for dialing in and being here. The questions have been terrific. I'll leave you again with that uncomfortable truth that failure is inevitable. Failure is always an option, but failure comes in different styles, different flavors. There are different types of failures. And when we recognize that there's a variety, that failure isn't all created equal, that's an important concept to grasp as well. And then failure is never the end of the story. Failure is not the whole story. Failure is just the beginning. It's a part of the story. And I think that sort of helps make the first truth slightly less uncomfortable.
Love that, Dan. That's so exciting to think about. And if failure is inevitable, that means you can have fun experimenting and trying new things too. So it opens a whole new world of possibilities, and it's fun to think about. So, well, with that, thank you so much for joining us in this Invisible Enemies of Innovation Quick Talk. We've put the link in the chat for our upcoming webinars, and we really hope to see you at the next one. So thanks again, Dan. You are awesome.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Rachel, this was a blast. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks. Bye.